So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Cory Chaudhary. One of the things I find most fascinating about her work is that she combines modern neurology and her training as a doctor with the ancient science of Ayurveda, the oldest system of medical practice on the planet. She has found that there's wisdom from both that when combined can make them so much more powerful. She believes on patient empowerment and a health-based rather than disease-based medical system. She's been a pioneer in the field of integrative medicine. She's developed a powerful system to manage chronic neurological disorders, things like multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, migraine, headaches. Her first book, The Prime, was published in 2016 and went on to become one of Amazon's bestsellers. She is a regular guest on the Dr. Oz Show, and she works in the Chopra Center as an Ayurvedic doctor. For more information on Dr. Kulreet Chaudhary, she has a website at www.drkulreetchaudhary.com. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you Dr. Chaudhary. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and I want to apologize to everyone for the delay, but Lexi and the whole team has been fantastic in navigating through some of my security system on my computer that would not allow me to participate. So I just want to start this by, first of all, just thank you for just the gracious hosting and in dealing with the little bit of delay. I'm so excited about hearing the questions that people have. This is a topic that is extremely near and dear, both to my heart, brain, and I guess gut, really. You can't really talk about the gut without talking about the brain and vice versa. And we had done an extensive presentation through Terry Talks roughly about a year ago. Cheryl, you can correct me if it was longer than that. And so that was kind of the first talk explaining the detailed premise within the book. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to just very generally go over that and spend most of the time answering questions. Now, for those of you who may not have had a chance to hear the first talk, or maybe unfamiliar with the book, perhaps what we can do is just make that talk available for you to reference back so that you have all of the information. So what I'd like to do...
And so if I can interrupt for just a moment, folks, that talk is available on YouTube if you're used to finding videos on YouTube. It's under the Terry Talks Nutrition channel. It's actually one of our most popular, most replayed video presentations, Dr. Chaudhary. A lot of people really appreciate that video. So just hunt for it on YouTube, look for the Terry Talks Nutrition channel, look for Dr. Chaudhary's name, and you can listen to that on demand.
Ah, perfect. That way I'll have more time with questions today rather than trying to recap everything. But there's a few details I wanted to give. First, I get a lot of questions of how did a normal, and that's in quote, a normal neurologist come to become a specialist in the gut, and how did you get into Ayurvedic medicine? And the short version of the story really is that I became a patient, and I don't think I would have ever said it at the time, but thankfully I developed migraine headaches, and this was very shortly after I started practicing neurology. So after I finished my neurology residency at UCSD and, really felt like I knew everything. Nature and life have a way of bringing about humility and growth and personal growth through these types of experiences, and I developed migraine headaches. And up until then, I really didn't even appreciate what migraine headaches were. I didn't realize how disabling they were and how disruptive they were. And so initially I, thought no problem. This is a little bit of, nature's joke of a neurologist developing migraine headaches, no problem. I know all the medications to use for the treatment of these because that's what I do for a living, and that's what I've spent the last 20 years essentially getting to the point to be able to do. And I started taking the medications that I had so often prescribed to my patients, and I basically had every possible side effect that you could have, to the point that I could not figure out if the headaches were worse or if the medications were worse. And because, this was really the crux of my entire education, I was quite stubborn about it, and so I kept experimenting from one to the next, to the next, to the next. until I finally just gave up and really thought that I was going to simply have migraine headaches from this point on. It got to a point, though, that it was essentially unbearable. And so what do you do when you can't figure out how to manage your health? Well, what I did is I actually turned to my mom. Because when we were growing up, my mom had introduced me to Ayurvedic medicine, but we didn't really ever see it as a medical system because it was just always little preventive approaches, or if something came up, we would turn towards the kitchen or open up the cupboards and she would pull out the turmeric or pull out the honey or pull out the garlic or the ginger. And that was the way that we approached health in my family. And from time to time when I was young, she would take me to see these Ayurvedic physicians, and they would kind of just fine-tune any little things that we needed. So I turned to her, and she helped to reconnect me to some of the Ayurvedic physicians that were rotating from India into the U.S. So I went in to see the Ayurvedic physician, and quite honestly, even though I grew up with this, at this point I was a bit cynical because I had gone through my neurology training, my medical training, and this was no longer really an active part of my life. But I had no other choices, so I went in somewhat willingly, but extremely skeptic. And the most surprising conclusion out of that appointment, out of that visit with the Ayurvedic physician, or as we say, Vaidya, was that he said all of my issues were gut-related. And again, being the cynical neurologist at that point, I looked at him and just felt like he had not heard a word of my history, that I was talking about my head the entire time, and he's talking about my gut the entire time. Nonetheless, he put together a prescriptive approach which had several components, including some dietary changes, some lifestyle changes, and some supplements. And at this point, I really had nothing to lose, so I went and I started the program without really any expectation that it would work, because again, this guy was talking about my gut the whole time and not the actual problem, which was in my head. Within 3 months, I was completely headache-free, but it did not stop there. Within 6 months, I would say I had the level of energy that I had not experienced until probably since my 20s. And the benefits just kept on growing. My creativity was improving, my mood, which I didn't even know really I had an issue with mood. I kind of felt the normal ups and downs that I think most of us go through the day. That completely smoothed out. And I was just really shocked that addressing the digestive system could actually give so much back to an individual, you know, not just in terms of my migraine headaches, but I really felt like I was reversing the clock of aging. And so I was so excited about my own results, and I was so excited to give all of this information to my patients. So I began my own training as a neurologist, as an Ayurvedic practitioner, as a neurologist practicing Ayurvedic medicine. And so I had all of this information, and I knew what to do, and so I went into my patients, and I was just ready basically to conquer all of their disease. And what happened was I had all of this information to give them, and the majority of people couldn't do it. And it wasn't because they didn't want to do it. It wasn't because they weren't motivated. It wasn't because they didn't have the energy or time. These were people who were successful in so many other areas of their life, but for some reason they could not change the foods that they ate in particular. So I began to look at this more so as a neuroscientist than as a Ayurvedic practitioner, trying to figure out why was it so difficult for them to change the way that they were eating. And what I found was that there were actually obstacles to change, and these are not psychological obstacles or motivational obstacles. These were actually biochemical obstacles to change your diet, and this was a critical part of Ayurvedic medicine, is to change the way that you are eating. And the four main obstacles that I found was that our human bodies, because of our current environment, our current lifestyles, were experiencing a complete toxic overload. Part of this, as I mentioned already, comes from the environment. Part of this comes from the foods we're eating, and part of this comes from just simply the way that we're living. The second major obstacle to overcome were food addictions, that our food is actually engineered now to be addictive. So, of course, it was difficult for people to change. If they were eating this highly addictive food, it would be very similar to asking a cocaine addict to simply will themselves out of taking cocaine. And so many of our studies now show this, that food can change the brain very similarly to how drugs change the brain. I think food is such a much more dangerous addiction in that it's so readily available, and we're constantly advertising the addiction, and it's cheap and affordable and available everywhere. The third obstacle is what I call the dumb gut. And the dumb gut is really where the enteric nervous system, or the brain in the gut, is no longer functioning the way that it should be. What we are finding, and what Ayurvedic medicine basically knew 5,000 years ago, is that there's this communication between the brain and the gut, and the communication, which was totally shocking to me, is mostly the gut talking to the brain. And when you have a smart gut communicating to your brain, you make healthy decisions spontaneously. And when you have a smart gut, it also means that you have a smart microbiome living in your gut, and that's the collection of bacteria and other organisms that basically support us as a living being. They support every function, not just digestion, but every function. But most people had lost this smart gut and instead were dealing with this dumb gut. And the fourth obstacle to change was leaky brain. And this is essentially when all of the inflammation, all of the toxicity that is being generated from the gut starts to affect the brain. So again, I am not going to go into the details of these simply because we do have that previous talk available that goes into each one of these in great detail, because I really want to hear your questions today. But essentially what I did is I began to identify the solutions, and this was the part that kind of blew my mind because the solutions were all outlined also in Ayurvedic medicine, again, 5,000 years ago. But how did they anticipate from 5,000 years ago the answers to the problems that we were having today? So I started to look at Ayurvedic medicine differently, not the way that it was traditionally taught, but more from the perspective of our modern day challenges. And I began to put together a program that essentially reversed these particular biochemical obstacles. And what I found was that not only were people able to start to change their diet, but if we first detoxed them and broke this food addiction cycle and brought back in a smart gut and reversed this inflammatory process in the brain, not only were there neurological issues starting to resolve, which of course was my ultimate goal, but there was a very unexpected outcome of weight loss. Now, I heard back from patients for many, many years about, how they were dropping 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds on the program, and it never once impressed me because, I was a neurologist and I was mainly interested in their brain health. But what I eventually found out was that if I mentioned the weight loss up front, people were far, far more religious about the program. They were more really detailed about following the regimen because they were so excited about the weight loss. Now, for those who didn't have weight to lose, you wouldn't lose it because it was really just a process of removing the toxins, and as you remove the toxins, the weight automatically comes out. And so this is how I eventually wrote the book, The Prime, which is a book written by a neurologist who unexpectedly became an Ayurvedic practitioner and who even more unexpectedly became a weight loss expert in the process of creating a program to reverse neurological disease. So with that kind of introduction, what we're going to do is we're going to open it up to some of your questions. And so I don't know if, Cheryl, you want to jump in just one more time and explain again how people can enter in the questions, and then we're going to first go through a few of the frequently asked questions and then begin to go through your guys' questions.
Absolutely, and I'll be glad to moderate those questions as well, because some of them may have come via one route or another, and I would rather you spend your valuable time answering the questions than sorting through. So if you do have a question, please look at the chat box or the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. If you don't see it, then up here at the top you will see an icon that says Q&A or chat. There are two different methods by which you can communicate with us. Type in the small white box at the bottom of the screen, press send, and your message will appear up here. The default position is to send it to all participants. If there's something you'd like to ask behind the scenes in the chat box, you can also select to send it to Lexi Locke, who's our webinar producer. The method is same for the QA. You type your message in the small box, select send, and your message appears in the order in which it was received. So why don't we get started, and Dr. Chaudhary, let's talk about some of those frequently asked questions.
Thank you, Cheryl. You're so fantastic at organizing all of this and leading people to the right boxes. That's probably the most critical role in these webinars. So let's start with those frequently asked questions. So how do you know if you have toxic overload? So there's several ways that I figure this out as a practitioner. A lot has to do with the Ayurvedic physical exam, particularly the pulse evaluation. But for those of you who may not have direct access to an Ayurvedic practitioner, the simplest way really to know is if you're dealing with anything chronic. So the philosophy in Ayurvedic medicine is that when there's not an accumulation of toxins, so you can still have an imbalance, but not an accumulation of toxins, you should not have anything chronic. Meaning things may come and go. You might feel a little congested after a meal, but then you notice, maybe in a day or two that it's gone. Or let's say you eat something that's inflammatory and your joints ache a little bit, but then same thing, in a few days it's gone. That usually doesn't mean that you have toxic overload. But if you're waking up every single day with some kind of chronic symptom, and it could be something like fatigue, just that every single day you wake up and you're tired, that would be a sign that there is toxic overload. Now, another simple thing you can do, and the book actually goes through a gut IQ test that helps you to determine how smart your gut is. And really, the dumber your gut, the more toxic overload you're going to have. And so in the book, we have an entire list of questions that help to clue you into that. But a really simple thing to do is first thing when you wake up in the morning, if you take a look at your tongue, if you have a white coating on your tongue, that is a sign that there is toxic overload. So first to start with that, just wake up tomorrow morning and take a look at your tongue. The next question, what do you think about gluten-free and dairy-free diet choices? So I have a short answer for this and a long answer for this. I'm going to start with the short answer. I've got kind of the longer answer is explained in the book, but it depends on who's asking the question. So in Ayurvedic medicine, we don't look as much into making general recommendations as we do at what is your gut IQ, how strong is your digestion, and then we're able to say what you can and cannot eat. So for those who have a very strong digestion, and unfortunately in our modern world, there's just not a whole lot of people out there anymore that have strong digestion. But for those who have strong digestion, and, you think about like your teenage years where, I remember being able to eat just about anything up to a point, they don't have to worry so much about things like gluten and dairy, because even if they are producing some toxicity as a result of eating them, and really gluten in particular, our modern day gluten is quite inflammatory for everyone, but if you're able to manage the toxic load, then it's not an issue. The issue becomes as your gut becomes dumber, as your digestion becomes weaker, then things that are naturally more inflammatory or naturally more difficult to eat become much more difficult to deal with the sequelae of, especially the toxic sequelae. And you have to look at what type of wheat are you eating, especially modern wheat, which has so much more gluten, and modern dairy, which has been homogenized and the cows aren't being taken care of. You have to look at the sources of these things, too, before you say you can't have wheat or you can't have dairy. But for most people who are dealing with the toxic overload, these are the first two things that I do tend to take out. And it's interesting because even for myself, I tend not to eat gluten simply because of the nature of modern wheat every once in a while, but not very often. And same thing for dairy. I tend to limit it, and when I have it raw. But when I go to India and I have the milk from the cows that are being raised out in the village, and these are cows that haven't been bred any particular way, they're, I guess you would call them heirloom cows, but they're, the original cows that populated the planet. The milk there is so pure that I have absolutely no problems with it. I can have it every single day with no problems whatsoever. And so that really speaks to the point that the source of these things, the source of these foods is so important. What diet do you recommend? What if I'm vegetarian? Well, again, the answer is who's asking the question. Now, I have been non-vegetarian at one point, vegan at one point, then vegetarian again at one point, and now as I'm starting to transition into, we'll just call it the golden years as you start approaching menopause, I've had to reintroduce some meat selectively to help with some of the transitions that are happening in my body, and I do the same thing for other women that I see in clinic. And so, again, it depends. It depends on what is your underlying body type and what is going on in your health right now. And I used to be very, very, very strict about being vegetarian, and I do think that in general, for the majority of people, a vegetarian diet does work. And when you look at the health of the world, the health of our actual planet, a vegetarian diet seems to support the kind of environmental needs of the planet as well. However, under certain circumstances, when you are depleted, when you have things like adrenal fatigue, or for women as they start to go into perimenopause or menopause, those are times where we do sometimes have to add in specific food sources from animals. And kind of segueing into the next question, what's the deal with bone broth, I will oftentimes add in bone broth first because it has the healing collagen that helps to heal the GI tract. It has a variety of sources of minerals, and it is one of the most absorbable forms of animal protein, or basically the most absorbable animal source. Now, sometimes, in addition to bone broth, we have to add some other things, but for the majority of people, because bone broth is just so nourishing and so easy to incorporate into your body, that is typically enough. So the reason why bone broth is becoming so popular is really because our guts are becoming so inflamed and so destroyed that we're needing a Band-Aid. So in the past, people used bone broth. You hear about, chicken bone being kind of the old penicillin that was used, because really it was in times when people were depleted, when they weren't feeling as healthy, we would add in bone broth. But now, unfortunately, that's the case for the majority of people, and so bone broth has become a more prevalent way of addressing gut issues and rebuilding vitality into the body. So, and this is, it's kind of funny because if I had this conversation with my younger self, I wouldn't even have listened to myself because I was such a staunch vegan, and then eventually started adding in, ghee and some other sources of dairy like kefir and yogurt into my diet. But you really can't be stuck on one type of diet and one type of way of eating. You have to look at meat as medicine and not something that you just go to for pleasure. but you really have to look at food as medicine and see what is it that your body needs and then respond accordingly. So what is the gut-brain connection? What is not the gut-brain connection? This gut-brain connection, it impacts just about everything in our body. But a simple way of looking at this is really that there's a communication that goes on between our gut and our brain. And as I mentioned earlier, the brain is really doing a lot of the listening, and the gut is doing a lot of the talking. And so this is really hinting at the relationship of the microbiome, particularly the organisms, the bacteria, yeast, and so forth that live in our GI tract, and what information they are providing to our brain. And what we're finding out is it's quite a lot. They produce different neurotransmitters, which is essentially the chemicals that serve as the language for the brain. Depending on the type of microbiome, the type of bacteria and microorganisms that live in our GI tract, they can actually influence our behavior. This was kind of shocking to me at first, but then I've seen it over and over and over that as we just take simple steps, and this is what's outlined in my book, The Prime, but as we take simple steps to shift the microbiome, I couldn't believe at how spontaneously behaviors changed. So it's really not something that I would even look at as, you know, people often say there's a second brain in your gut. It's really not two separate brains. They're a part of the same system of intelligence, one that is located in your skull, the other one that is located in your GI tract, but they work as a whole unit to help you function as a human being. So how does Ayurveda fit into all of this, and what is a dosha? I look at Ayurveda as the original lifestyle medicine on the planet. And as we start to look at some of the ancient records, it looks like this was really a set of scientific ideas and a belief system of how human beings work and how they interact with nature that we really were able to find almost everywhere on the planet. And only more in recent years, or I shouldn't say years, really centuries, did it become kind of extinct in many cultures, but somehow it stayed preserved mostly in India. So I don't tend to look at Ayurveda as something that necessarily only was happening in India. It seemed to be at one time a system of approaching human health and human experience that we shared in multiple cultures all over the planet, but somehow slowly decayed but remained the most consistent in one place, which happened to be India. So as far as we know, it's the oldest healing tradition on the planet. And what is a dosha? Well, the way that Ayurvedic medicine describes it, and as you go into, for example, TCM or even some of the shamanic traditions, like in Peru and other areas in Latin America, they describe this similarly, although they'll use different terminology. These are mind-body types that serve as a blueprint for us to guide people on how they should live. And it influences everything from what you should eat to your sleep to how much you should exercise. It's essentially looking at the overall principles that are in balance or out of balance in your body and your mind. And it doesn't disconnect the person from nature or from what you can say, you know, their own source of energy or their spirituality. All of that is brought together in this description of a dosha. And so when a patient comes in to see me, the first thing I do is to see what dosha is out of balance. And I create a prescriptive plan how to bring that dosha back into balance using multiple different things. How do I find a practitioner who understands the gut-brain connection? Well, the fortunate thing is that in today's world, you have several different sources because this is really becoming recognized. Although when I first started this, it was considered voodoo. Now we just have so much research that many, many physicians, integrative practitioners as well as MDs, are really being educated on this and are addressing this regularly in their practice. So you can find an Ayurvedic practitioner, and this is really the heart of Ayurveda. You can find a naturopathic doctor, and their training is also very, very deeply steeped in this. You can also find a traditional Chinese medicine doctor, again, also deeply steeped in this, or you can find a functional medicine doctor, and their training goes deeply into this connection. The question is just which approach suits you the most. Each of these different groups just approaches the gut-brain axis slightly differently. The last question, do you offer phone consultations? So I am working at the Chopra Center, and for those who live in California, and this is not my rule, I would love to be able to consult with anyone anywhere. This is California's rule. I'm able to do phone and Skype consultations as long as I'm practicing in California. I can do Skype and phone consultations only for those who live in California. But this was really why I wrote the book, The Prime, because I knew that I was hitting this point that the knowledge had to get out to people, and there was no way for me to see every single person who needed this. And one of the things that has been the most rewarding of writing this book has been the way that physicians out in the community have embraced it, and they're actually offering the information to their patients, which is really kind of what my hope was, is that somehow this information, this knowledge would be disseminated and that physicians would be willing to work with patients, since I did provide so much scientific research to support the ideas. And for those who have not heard of the book, essentially it just details the modern biochemical dilemma in changing our food choices. It explains the Ayurvedic perspective of this modern dilemma, and it gives a 4-phase Ayurvedic detox program using teas, herbs, and foods to build a smart gut and drop the pounds spontaneously. And again, even though it's been marketed as a weight loss book, I used it as a program to repair neurological disease. So for those who are suffering from any type of neurological conditions, really this book was written first and foremost for you, but it has found a much, much larger audience. And the way that you can use this book is just depending on the severity of what you're going through. You can either use it on your own, but what I have found is it's been most rewarding when patients are able to find an integrative practitioner who will go through the program with them and help to guide them in maybe needing to modify a few things or adding in certain things. And I mentioned quite a few suggestions even in the book that you may want to consider adding this or you may want to consider doing this. But I find that that is one of the best ways. We've had many, many people who've done this in their families or as, you know, girlfriends or other groups together, and they've just had such an enjoyable time. So let me stop there, and Cheryl, why don't we look at some of the questions that are coming in, and we'll use the rest of our time to answer those.
Excellent. You know, I see a theme recurring in some of these, and it has to do with the intersection between hormones and gaining weight. One of our very first questions is for menopausal women who have hormonal imbalances. Maybe they have some lower progesterone or estrogen, and then they also develop insulin resistance. At which phase of the prime does weight loss happen the most, and how does that work? And do you run into this a lot, where hormones are getting in the way of accomplishing your goals?
Oh my gosh, what a fabulous question to start with. So partly because I'm in that phase of life where I have become very interested even in my own hormones. And I guess the unique journey for me as a physician is that when something happens to me, like this, you know, whole program came because I had gut issues and I wanted to understand why, and I wanted to understand why they affect the nervous system. Well, then as I started to enter into my 40s, of course, you know, I started to have to deal with the hormonal changes, and that has led to an entire new journey, which I'm hoping won't take a decade to summarize and get out to the public, because this is a huge, huge issue. And it's actually, in the beginning, I thought it was a very depressing issue because I was like, oh my God, I can't believe what's happening to women in the modern era, because it's not just your hormones. It's the way that environmental toxins are accelerating the hormonal changes in women in a way that we have never seen before. So we are seeing problems for perimenopausal and menopausal women that never existed even a century ago. So I'd love to try to give as short an answer as possible, but essentially, you know, but still answer your question fully, but essentially they do play a huge issue, but one of the critical factors is still gut health, that if without that, you can't really balance the rest of the axis. And I realized that for me, as I started to experience this, that having an intact gut was key to fine-tuning everything else. But then the other things that need to be taken into consideration, and you know, one of the things that she brought up was the decline in progesterone and estrogen. Well, progesterone declines much, much faster than estrogen, and this taxes the adrenal system hugely. And so one of the other things that you have to address is adrenal fatigue, which, as I've started to do the research, I think at the very least 50% of women by the time they hit their mid-30s have some form of it. And by the time they hit their 40s, because of these environmental factors, how they affect your hormones, I think it's close to 100% of women have some form of adrenal fatigue. And by the time they hit menopause, it's almost extreme adrenal fatigue. And this throws off a number of other organ systems, and this aggravates the whole issue of weight loss because your body can't really lose the weight when it's in a state of such severe depletion because it's trying to hold on to everything. And another aspect of this is, again, how your body is able to detoxify in the setting of this hormonal change. Your potential for detoxification goes down considerably. So this is something that I would say I'm almost 80% done with my research, and it's been absolutely fascinating because the people who have been coming in to help train me in this and give me the answers are coming from all over the world, from all walks of life, and I'm learning Taoist practices that women need to be doing in their 40s to help with this issue that absolutely change the game completely for women. So I'm hoping to pull all of this together in the next couple of years to be able to write about this, because it is such a huge issue, and it's so much more than just the way many people approach it, which is, oh, just take these supplements, or, oh, you just have to, you know, work on the adrenals, or, oh, you just have to take, you know, hormones. No, it's much, much, much more than that, and it starts for us, for most women, in their 30s, and as you start to go back in time and start looking at the early signs, it's just an absolutely very profoundly healing experience, because a lot of the things that we think, like, why am I getting crankier? Why am I getting more irritable? Like, it's all, once again, biochemically explained. So I'm trying not to just kind of dangle that carrot in front of you, but it's actually something that I'm actively working on right now to give you a more thorough answer.
Excellent. You know, we have, I know that you can't go through each individual case history for folks and help them figure out what their problems might be, but here's an interesting case. They're not asking you to diagnose, but they've had a loss of consciousness on 2 different occasions. It's unwitnessed, but their testing is negative, and the neurologist believes they've had 2 seizures. So they started them on an anti-seizure medication, Keppra, 500 milligrams twice a day, and they immediately gained 15 pounds, and now they're really fatigued as well. They also have reflux and Prilosec. So they have a lot of physical issues that are going on right now that they believe your program might be very useful for. But they're wondering, is there any contraindications that you're aware of with any of the herbs or the types of interventions that you describe in your book, The Prime, for use in these types of situations?
No, not for people who are on seizure medications. There are a few medications, and especially once we get into scenarios where people are on 5 or 6 different medications, I'd say you really need to work with a physician, mainly because your need for many of these medications goes down. And so let's say, for example, you're on blood pressure medication and you do the program and you're starting to get lightheaded. Well, it might be because you need to reduce your blood pressure dose, the dose of the medication. So that's why I always say, you know, if you're being actively treated for something, always do the program with your doctor. But for something as specific as this, for Keppra, no contraindications. But I do want to say, though, that we do, and this is what I, you know, did as a neurologist, there are natural programs and there are herbs, actually 2 are in the program, that help with seizures, and oftentimes I was able to get people off their seizure medications very, very, very slowly over the course of 1 to 2 years. But there are natural approaches for managing seizures, and I really, really do empathize with all of the side effects that, you know, this person is experiencing with the medication, because until I had to start taking many of those medications, because many of the medications for migraine headaches are anti-seizure medications, I did not appreciate just how disabling the side effects were. So certainly no contraindication, but I would just encourage you either to work with an Ayurvedic practitioner or with a functional medicine doctor or with a naturopathic doctor, because there are other things you can do that where you could, at the very least, reduce your dose of Keppra and hopefully reduce the side effects.
Excellent. While we're on the topic of contraindications, we also have the question, is it okay to continue taking supplements if supplements are helping while you're on doing the prime?
Absolutely. So as you go through the prime, you'll see that there's not a whole lot you take out, and this is what was surprising to most people, because they said, you know, how is this a weight loss program, but I'm not taking out any foods? And I said, because you're changing your gut flora, and so you're not having to really change your habits from the outside. They're going to change naturally from within. But when it comes to supplements, what I find is that for many people who have, quote unquote, a dumb gut, and this I'm just referring to your gut IQ score in the book, but for those who have a dumb gut, you're oftentimes not absorbing your supplements. So you might only be absorbing 10% of what you're actually taking. So for many of my patients, what I noticed is that we were able to reduce their supplements because their absorption was so much better, and they started absorbing more from their foods. So there's no problem with taking the supplements, but I just want you to consider as you go through it, do you really need to take as many supplements as you're currently taking?
Good answer. That certainly does make sense. You know, we all want to find that quick and easy intervention that spurs weight loss, and we do have a couple of questions along those lines asking about supplements that suppress appetite or help with weight loss, but it sounds from your lecture and from the information that you've provided today that that's not the way you approach it. The way you approach it is instead of don't focus on the weight loss, focus on fixing what's broken, and the weight loss happens naturally.
If you're taking a supplement that only results in weight loss, what's usually happening is you're losing weight because it's igniting an imbalance in the body. And by igniting that imbalance, yes, you'll lose weight, but you'll gain a bunch of other health problems. And this is what I, saw so much in my clinic, because many of those complications are neurological issues, because they increase what we call a Vata imbalance. So that's one of the doshas in Ayurveda that's linked to many neurological conditions. So they'll come in and they'll say, oh, I started this great thing and I can't believe I lost 20 pounds in 2 weeks, and now I can't sleep. Now I'm constipated. I'm anxious all of the time. I've got this tremor, and I'm starting to get forgetful. And so the point is never to do anything for weight loss, ever, ever, ever. The point is to do something to balance your body, and why not start with the one system that influences basically everything, which is the gut, and then allow the weight to come off. That is the healthiest way to approach it. And, one of our patients who had lost 100 pounds, she laughed. And, we did this over, I think it was about 1.5 years. she laughed because she goes, you never mentioned weight loss once. Like, we never even talked about it. And she goes, but I lost 100 pounds. And I said, because the weight is inconsequential. It's your health that we're focusing on. As you become healthier, the weight just naturally comes off, and that's really the way we should be living.
Mm-hmm. You know, we have a lot of questions on neurological diseases, and I know you've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to push them all into one question. And we've had a couple on Parkinson's disease, and a lot of it has to do with gut and Parkinson's. One of the questions is that they believe or they've heard that Parkinson's disease is totally related to gut bacteria, that gut bacteria is a primary factor. So they want to know what kinds of things, when people with Parkinson's disease or other kind of neurological diseases, how can they improve their symptoms after they already have the disease?
From Parkinson's to basically the majority of neurological diseases. And so when I used to say this, it was so funny. Cheryl, there was, how long ago was it? Maybe it was 7 years ago. I was interviewed by this really experienced Fox reporter, and his son was like at Harvard Med School, and they called on me because I was starting to generate a reputation as an MS, a multiple sclerosis specialist, and so he interviewed me. He had interviewed all of these amazing people, and he asked me the question, so what do you think is the big thing for MS in the future? And I said, I think what we're going to find is a connection that it has with your gut, particularly gut health and gut flora. And he looked up at me and actually rolled his eyes backwards.
Oh, no.
As a young physician, I was in my 30s then, as a young physician talking to, this extremely experienced Fox reporter that was, a little bit upset. And, it threw me off just for a moment, but I really stuck to my guns. I said, I know this sounds like just something coming from left field right now, but what we're going to find is how important gut health is to the brain. And MS, just like Parkinson's, just like so many other conditions, is no different. And so he was polite enough to let me finish, although I think he basically thought, it was coming from Mars. But this is not just for Parkinson's disease, it's really for all neurological conditions. And I mentioned quite a bit of this in the book. There's an entire chapter dedicated to this, and there's actually some specific studies on Parkinson's that I quote. But what we're finding is that the type of pathogenic bacteria, we can literally begin to fingerprint the type of bacteria you have and predict what type of disease you have, because certain toxins released by certain bacteria will result in certain neurological conditions, and not just neurological, multiple other conditions. And so they play a huge role. But one of the first things people do is they say, well, no problem, I'll just take probiotics. And, I, again, talk about this in the book, but it's not that I'm against probiotics, it's that probiotics have a place. But first create a home for them to thrive. Otherwise, it's a little bit like sending in, Girl Scouts into World War III. Where are they going to live? How are they going to thrive? So my approach is to first clean out the system, and it's not just taking a bunch of colonics or taking a bunch of, supplements to make you poop. That's not cleaning out the GI tract. It's cleaning out the whole body, doing it step by step, making sure that you are on a program so that you have nutrient density, meaning that you don't detox if you are depleted of nutrients in your body. And as you do that, you create an environment, then you can introduce probiotics. I prefer to do it via food. There's some great ones on the market, though, if you want to start with that, so that they can then populate. So, again, it's not just this, little simple fix, but as you, especially if you can work with somebody as you're implementing the program in the book, it just starts to spontaneously happen. And then once things are cleared out, you can repopulate the gut with healthy bacteria.
Excellent, which segues into our last question, and that has to do with something we didn't talk so much about today, but the use of fermented foods. All the interest in kimchi and sauerkraut and kombucha. Are these part of the solution, and do they work synergistically with your solution in the Prime?
So once again, it depends. And the tough thing is when we have trends here in the U.S. in particular, the assumption is everything is always good for everyone or everything is always bad for everyone. There's kind of these grandiose conclusions that are made. And once again, it depends. When your gut is really, really harmed, when it's really in an inflamed state, we don't use fermented foods at all, We first simply intervene and try to reduce the inflammation and heal the mucosa, because even fermented foods then become inflammatory. So they are added at a later point, but then choosing what type of fermented food is also individualized. So for example, we would not necessarily give every patient something like kombucha. We would not give every patient, something as heating as kimchi. The two types of fermented foods that are probably used the most regularly in Ayurvedic medicine is lassi, which is a type of yogurt drink, or yogurt itself. Kefir also is a very, very good choice, but we add them in at a particular time, and sometimes we have to start with very teeny tiny doses and combine spices that help with digestion, but it's not this path of just, if you don't have, healthy bacteria, just flood your body with a bunch of fermented foods. It really depends on what state you're in.
Mm-hmm. Well, that really makes sense. And I really like what you said about everything is not always bad, everything's not always good. It is true that we try to paint everything black and white, and there's a whole world of different colors in between those two extremes.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank you so much. We had several thank yous come in via our comment line, thanking you for sharing this information and thanking you and asking you to come back and do more. So we are very, very glad that we are able to get this information out to the people who need it most. I also want to remind you folks, especially those of you who might only be joining us via phone, that for more information, you can visit Dr. Chaudhary's webpage, which is drkulreetchaudhary.com, KULREETCHAUDHARY.com for more information. And thank you again for taking time out of your busy practice to share your information with us, Dr. Chaudhary.
It was my pleasure. It's always so much fun doing this with you guys.
Thank you. Folks, for more information on natural health, we hope that you will visit us at Terry Talks Nutrition. At that website, you can listen to recordings of past seminars. You can sign up for a free weekly newsletter. We never, ever share your email address with anyone else. It's a once-a-week newsletter full of health tips. And you can also ask Terry your own personal health questions. And again, that's at terrytalksnutrition.com. We also have a Terry Talks Nutrition YouTube channel. So if you would like to listen to this webinar presentation, or if you have any other interest in other webinar presentations, or if you have friends you think you could benefit from this information, feel free to visit us at any time, and you can listen to these webinars on demand. You can follow Terry on Twitter at twitter.com/TerryLimmerand. We'd be honored if you find us on Facebook. And thank you so much again for the time that you've spent with us today. Our next upcoming event is 10 Tips to Optimize Energy. That will be on Friday, July 21st at 3 p.m. with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and energy expert Dr. Jacob Teitelbaum. So I hope you'll join us again for that one. Thanks again for taking time out of your day to learn more about natural medicine interventions on the Terry Talks Nutrition Educational Webinar Series. And until we meet again, good health to you. Bye-bye.